A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. I seek refuge in Allah from Satan the accursed. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. Brothers and sisters in Islam and in humanity, I greet you with the greetings of peace, the greetings of Allah's prophets and messengers. Peace be upon you, or as we have it traditionally in Islam, Assalamu alaikum. You're welcome to the Sharia Intelligence course, a course where we will be looking at the principles of Islamic jurisprudence, the Islamic legal theory. We will also be looking at the Islamic legal maxims and legal philosophy and the higher intents, purposes and objectives of Islamic jurisprudence or of the Quran and Sunnah. I am your host, Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss this topic for today are two of our top facilitators in the subject of Sharia intelligence, Brother Ibrahim Bello and Brother Nasir Bello. You're both most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Today we will be looking at how scholars try to search for greater certainty. And we will start with a few definitions and distinctions. Firstly, we will look at fiqh and Sharia. Are there any similarities? What are the differences? And why is it important to distinguish between the two? Some people speaking Allah's name, they speak in God's name, they claim their position is the position of Allah. How do we handle this? So I'd like to start by asking Malam Ibrahim Bello, what do we mean by the term Sharia? What do we mean by fiqh? How are they similar? How are they different? And we'll get contributions also from Brother Nasir. Bismillah.
Now, Sharia literally just means the path to where you get water. But then it means the code, the way of life laid down by Islam. Sharia is the body of the law sent down by God to guide humanity. In other words, you can call it divine law. To this effect, it has areas of belief or creed, we call aqidah. It has some of it that is more ibadah related, as another branch of it, like how do you relate with God, how do you worship. It has akhlaq, which is more on character, behaviors, what do you do, how should you behave. It has another branch called mu'amalat, which is a bigger side of it, that is interpersonal relations, business transactions, inheritance, marital relations, and all of that. Now, this is Sharia. Sometimes it is loosely translated to mean Islamic law, but that's a little narrow, considering the name law in English. But then, a good number of people misunderstood it to just mean Sharia means the capital punishment. Capital punishment is actually a small portion, a very, very infinitesimal portion of Sharia, if at all. Now, the relationship between Sharia and fiqh is that fiqh is taken from Arabic word faqaha yafqahu, just means to understand, to comprehend. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا كَانَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ لِيَنْفِرُوا كَافَّةً فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ طَائِفَةٍ لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ. It does not befit believers to all go out for battle. Why not some people remain to يَتَفَقَّهَ, to learn, to comprehend. So, but technically it comes to mean understanding of Sharia as to where it will be applied and for practical purpose. Since this is the body of the law, you need interpretation. It's like the law and the practical. So that is fiqh. Of course, sometimes they are interchangeably used. When you say in Sharia, in fiqh, but like we want a very clear-cut demarcation. Fiqh has to do more with human reasoning, human understanding, human application of Sharia. So there is some human factor in fiqh. So in other words, Sharia is divine, fiqh is not divine. So now, as whether it is related to punishment, of course, like I said before, yes, part of Islamic law you have some very, very small portion that has to do with capital punishment. What is actually specified by Sharia, I'm not sure, is more than 6. Very, very. Of more than 1,000 possibility of crimes you can commit and you can be judged. Islam only have capital punishment fixed only for like 5 or 6. So it is not fair for somebody to say Sharia means capital punishment. But that's a paradigm and misconception that we really need to correct.
Okay. So one of the things you've mentioned is Sharia. From the word Shari comes from the lawgiver.
Yes.
In other words, it's divine guidance. Part of that guidance is guidance on beliefs.
Yes.
Some of that guidance is guidance on worship. Some of that guidance is on behavior. And some is on law. And of the law part, you have a lot of human reasoning now coming to apply laws to many other issues that are not part of the divine. And that extension is where fiqh and human understanding comes in, and the various tools of fiqh and ijtihad. And as you mentioned, part of law is punishment, and part of punishment are hudud. And those are where we find some of the fixed punishments. But the punishment is actually a very small part of law, and law is a small part of Sharia. Brother Nasir, what would you add to this discussion?
Well, I think another addition to particularly the difference between Sharia and fiqh is the fact that Sharia constitutes the whole, while fiqh is the part of the whole, as you just rightly mentioned, how fiqh is a portion or a segment of the law, while you have other things around akhlaq, around aqidah, ahkam al-i'tiqadiyya, ahkam al-akhlaqiyya, and all other divisions that are categorized under Sharia, which fiqh is just a part of. Again, Sharia is divine, fiqh is human. Sharia is fixed, permanent, while fiqh is temporary. And Sharia is independent, while fiqh is completely dependent. Sharia constitutes the source of this aspect of the religion that is called ma'lum min ad-dini bid-darura, is constituting this aspect of Sharia, of the religion, that is qat'iyyu thubur, qat'iyyu dilala, while issues around the dhanni, secondary sources of Sharia, are all tied to the aspect of fiqh. Sharia is infallible, while fiqh is fallible. Sharia doesn't change, while fiqh is mutable, it does change. And again, in the discourse around issue of punishment, you would find the aspect of Sharia under punishment is the hudud, as you rightly mentioned, which constitute a very, very small portion on aspect to do with punishment. And you find a very, very large domain of ta'zir, where it's subject to human discretion, human reasoning, human evaluation. So these are some of the differences between Sharia and fiqh.
Interesting. And so from what you're saying is, when you said we only have one Sharia, but we also have many fiqh or many schools of fiqh, but we don't talk about many schools, madhabs of Sharia. It's madhabs of fiqh and madhabs of aqidah, but one Sharia. And I think this takes us also to where we have some confusion, which is sometimes the area of overlap. That Sharia does have laws, and fiqh is the subject of laws, and so some topics in fiqh are divine or have a divine source. Some laws have divine source, but probably most laws, even in Islamic jurisprudence, are not products of divine Sharia, but products that are to some extent guided by the Sharia, but in reality are products of ijtihad and juristic reasoning. So we do have that overlap between the subjects. However, I think the distinction between the two and the trying to pick one issue and determine, is this divine or is this ruling human? Is this something where it belongs to, as you put, the ma'lum min ad-din bid-darura, the fundamental essentials of divine revelation, in other words, what is clearly divine, and what is a product of human reasoning and ijtihad, yes, guided the way the Sahaba were guided, but still fallible, still liable to error and open to diversity. Why is it important, Brother Nasir, and I'd expect contributions from you too, please. Why have some felt it is important to distinguish the two, to separate the two, to not just treat it all, it's all Islamic law, but, because some say Sharia is Islamic law. Why is it important to try and separate the two? Why are some scholars very concerned about distinguishing them and not just we go ahead?
Well, I think part of the reasons why most scholars are interested in separating or creating a dichotomy between the two is, one, to demonstrate different domains, the domains that are actually open to discussion and conversation and engagement, the big field of ijtihad which is attributed to the fiqh related area of human processes of ijtihad, and that domain of concluded matters that are fixed, that reflect the aspect of Sharia, things that have been concluded and no issues, no conversation around there. And the second issue is to avoid, or to a large extent minimize, the accusation of heresy, of apostasy, of blasphemy amongst Muslims. And another important reason is blurring the distinction often culminate into arrogating or recognizing or attributing the divine features and the divine quality to human beings. And often what you see, if these things happen, is you will see increasing sectarian tensions and divide. You will see takfir flying all over. You will see issues of ridda, and most conflicts that are actually emanating among Muslims are related to these kind of things. In fact, if you look at interfaith issues, interfaith divide, interfaith conflict in the history, in the Muslim history, you will find that most of the issues are dhanni related issues. Most of the issues are domain of ijtihad that ideally it is okay, it is ordinarily okay to agree to disagree and to have a conversation around that.
So this big problem you're mentioning, and I think we see it today in a lot of violent extremist groups where they have no problem killing other human beings, killing Muslims, based on interpretations that ordinarily you would say this is an area of diversity of opinion among scholars. But because they treat that as Sharia, it's divine, and unfortunately many people seem to just take Islamic law is all Sharia, Islamic law is all divine, without appreciating what you said, the huge field of ijtihad and juristic diversity. Brother Ibrahim, why else do you think this, or what would you add to this question of the importance of the distinction and the dangers of meshing the divine and the human?
Yeah, why it is true that interchangeably, loosely you use Sharia to mean fiqh is vital to have a thick line of divide between the two, for a number of reasons, part of which he mentioned. One of it is it allows the flexibility of where we need reform. You see, the ruling prohibition of alcohol is a done deal. It's Sharia. Haram. That's the ruling. No scholar will change it. But there are circumstances where a scholar will give verdict that based on this circumstance, and for this reason, this product for now, you cannot. So, similarly, a number of laws relating to marriage, relating to transactions, land laws, and some of these new issues, and ruling scholars itemize in books of fiqh regarding some of the things to do before you pray, who should relate with, what you should not do, who should not marry who. A number of them were actually product of this ijtihad. Some of them, as good as beautiful as they are, have outlived their usefulness, and so they need to reform. But when people refuse to accept that there is a difference between Sharia and fiqh, to them everything is Sharia. They are immutable. It's God. Even though some of these compilations were done with sincere intention 1,000 years ago. And with particularly with our ever-changing world, predictions beyond 5 years are even difficult to make, let alone books that were compiled for some context 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So these are part of the problem. Similarly, people fail to differentiate between what there are possibilities, even though they emanate from Sharia, as we say, but Sharia allow for the possibility of more than one interpretation, and all will be valid. Similarly, people now start, castigating and condemning others to hell, that you are a kafir, you are a mubtadi, you are a fasik, you are a this, you are a that, simply because I disagree with you on issues that ordinarily are secondary. They don't even matter. In fact, if some of those scholars should live today, they would have obsolete their books and some of their ideas on some of that. So that is why it is important that we differentiate and we try to understand what are the thawabit, what are the mutaghayyirat. 5 daily prayers, Ramadan, and all of those things, they are done deal. Nobody is coming to tell you to change them today. But there are a number of superficial things, and those are the areas of debate. Assalamu alaikum, one salam terminates prayer, or it's two. And some believe if you just say one, you can't pray behind you. This has been a subject all along. Whether your hands on your chest or you leave your hands down. Whether this or that. What's the position of leaving your beard? What is this? What? All of these things are subjected to interpretation. But when people refuse to have this kind of mindset and their own version of Islam, from the mazhab and the things they are coming from, is the only Islam. Anything aside that, they don't seem to recognize it and they view it as somebody else other than being a Muslim. This is the basis of the problem.
This is very interesting, that this blurring of the difference and the assigning of divine qualities to human effort to treat, when the Quran would put it that innal hukmu lillah, that, law, judgment belongs to Allah. But to take that and start putting that as equivalent to what human beings are doing, and that this my madhab or this position of my scholar is Allah's position, starts to create legal stagnancy, as you've mentioned, where if some of these scholars were to come today, a lot of their ijtihad would change. But then we are sometimes hanging more onto their books than even they did at their own time. And you find this anti-legal reform of ijtihadi laws holding some societies and creating a lot of oppression. I remember a scholar saying how if you pick nearly any of the classical books on Islamic finance or Kitabu Buyu, you would find probably 90 to 95% of the discussions there are obsolete and not relevant to any contemporary case. In other words, even those teachers would have told you these books should have been put aside and new ones. The question I would like to ask next, Malam Ibrahim, is on the tendency to speak in God's name. Where does that come from? And what challenges do we face from this?
Yeah, when you say you speak in God's name, simply is to assume the position of legislating, of making something haram or something binding. And if you don't do it, you commit sin. And if you do it, you commit sin. This is great. And most of the Prophet's debates over time with his contemporaries revolved around this. It's interesting to know that most of Surah Al-Ma'idah and the whole of Surah Al-An'am were revealed refuting these kind of things that the Arabia come to have. They were the basis for superstition and idolatry. In fact, Ibn al-Qayyim said, Aslul kufru al-qawlu ala Allahi bila ilm. That the origin of disbelief was actually for people to assume that position of God. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala challenged this seriously. He said, وَلَا تَقُولُوا لِمَا تَصِفُ أَلْسِنَتُكُمُ الْكَذِبَ هَذَا حَرَامٌ وَهَذَا حَلَالٌ لِتَفْتَرُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ. Never should you, with your mere utterances, lying against God, begin to say this is permissible and this is prohibited. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَفْتَرُونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ لَا يُفْلِحُونَ. So to this effect, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala condemn and challenges. Man harrama zinata Allahi allati akhraja li ibadi. That is challenge. Why? Who else? Who prohibit the beautiful things Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, provided for his servants? So it is a great sin, and it could be tantamount to shirk for somebody to say God say, and particularly you are making it binding when you don't have a clear-cut evidence where you can call qat is thubut, qat'i dilala. It is absolutely wrong. Even the Prophet ﷺ will not do it if he doesn't have directive from God. And it's enough to make somebody a disbeliever, because those are sole prerogative of Allah alone. So for one to speak, and how is this done? It's done very loosely and easily. For the fact that somebody asks you, what is the position of Islam on this? You should be careful if you're a scholar. Careful when you are telling them what you think is the position of Islam from your own understanding and what is clear. If it is your position, say this is what I think, what I understand. Don't give them the impression that this is God says. If it is clear from Quran, then you tell them. Because a scholar is like a signatory on behalf of God. In this subject, Ibn al-Qayyim wrote a whole voluminous book. He called it Ilamul Muwaqqi'ina an Rabbil Alameen. The meaning is warning to those who sign on behalf of God. So if you're a scholar, you speak in the name of Islam, or people come to ask you, very careful of quickly rushing to say something is haram when you are not sure. You can say, I am not convinced, I am not comfortable, I don't like it. You can give them options and let them know the weakness and the limitations, rather than quickly going to say it is haram or it is wajib. It's a great sin. Be very cautious.
So this need to be very careful about the arrogance of saying my view is actually Allah's view, when you know there are other scholars who hold differing views, and they are probably, if not as good as you, much more competent as scholars. And the need for, again, intellectual humility in saying this is what I understand of the divine. And I know others have differing views, but this is the one I find most convincing, at least for now. Brother Nasir, what would you add to this discussion?
Well, I think it is really a very important issue, speaking in God's name, and the problems that are tied to that. I think one of the issues is often it results in the disorientation of values and priorities. You would find petty squabbles turning minor issues, making them big, or big issues making them minor. And another thing that is very, very important, and you will find most of these issues, as we said earlier, most of these issues of differences of opinion, most of these issues that lead to sometimes even takfir of the other, are under this category of minor issues being converted to making big thing of a very minor issue, regurgitating small issues and making them big. Another thing that is also important to look into as it relates to this very important issue of speaking in God's name is it leads to shirk or bid'ah, and sometimes changing Islam itself. And of course, the Quran warned us on regarding the issue of worshipping scholars, where the Quran talks about ittakhadhu ahbarahum wa ruhbanahum arbaban min dunillah, and that they have turned their rabbis, their al-kitab have turned their rabbis and their teachers to sort of partners to Allah. And the companions ask, how do you mean? What does that mean, Ya Rasulullah? He said, are they not turning something that is prohibited to permissible, or vice versa, and they accept? He said, yes, this is worshipping them. So Rasulullah, the Quran warned us about that, and you will find many traditions of Prophet ﷺ equally following suit, warning us against these kind of things. You will hear challenging statements, people come in with challenging statements like according to Shariah, according to Islam, as if he is now the voice of Allah. He is speaking in God's name, assuming that position. Oh, this is the position of Islam. I remember one incident in a discussion cycle back at home with some brothers, and we invited one scholar discussing over issues. One of the brothers made a point, and the point seems to contradict the position of the scholar. When the scholar was responding to the issue, he was like, people should fear Allah. How can you be doing itlaq of something that how can you be opening something that has restriction and has limitation, meaning what he is saying or his own opinion is that of Allah, and therefore if you contradict or if you have a different opinion from his position, that means you are trying to commit a sin.
You don't fear Allah.
Except you don't fear Allah because he represents Allah. So these are some of the things that usually happen with these issues of speaking in God's name. So it's very important for people to be humble and to understand that there is a space between what Allah says and what Allah meant. And all that scholars are trying to do in most cases is to get to the closest when it comes to understanding what Allah meant. And there should be this humility of believing that much as I believe I am saying the exact message, chances are I might be wrong, and be open and for one to be open to listen to other opinions and interpretation. Allahu Ta'ala alam.
Well, a very important point you've made about the need for humility. If I think of opinions I held, and I think, we've been in this area for decades, and have known each other, opinions we all held, let me speak for myself, 10 years ago.
Sure.
I disagreed with quite a number of issues 5 years ago with the opinions I held 10 years ago.
Yes.
And now I disagree with some positions because every day you are learning more.
Yeah.
You disagree with positions you held 5 years ago. And of course, you're quite worried, 5 years from now, how will I view some opinions I held today? And 10 years from now, if Allah spares our lives, how would we view some of the opinions we today view as this is the only truth, just because you've not read beyond what you have read so far? And the need to always be humble when it comes to my opinion, especially when but others differ. It's, as you've mentioned, it's very dangerous. It can lead to shirk, which is considered one of the greatest sins a Muslim can commit, to lie or contradict the lawgiver, to contradict Allah, or to speak and say about Allah based on ignorance, what you don't know, attributing your own position to Allah. What mechanisms are there in Islam, in Usulul Fiqh, in the subjects we are discussing, that can help reduce the tendency for people to arrogate divine authority to their positions, to reduce the tendency or chances of people speaking in God's name?
Well, I think some of the very important mechanisms that one should be able to always remember as you engage this issue of ijtihad and this domain of Sharia and fiqh and what have you, is number one, to recognize that dhanni text is presumptive and therefore it is open to a diverse interpretation. And number two is to understand the various levels of meaning and implication of the text, that it is not really straightforward, what the scholars call dilalatul alfaz, where you see scholars talking about certain text that is general, others are specific, what they call the am and the khas, the mujmal, which is open, and the mujmal, which is implicit, and mubayyin, which is explicit. They talk about mutlaq, which is open, muqayyid, which is specified, and many others talking about dilalat of ishara, mafhum al-mukhalafa, all these concepts of trying to understand the linguistic interpretation and the nuanced meanings and implication in the text are very important in trying to engage with these issues of fatwa, ijtihad, and what have you. And another very important mechanism, in my opinion, is being able to classify all secondary tools of ijtihad as zanni, and therefore they are subject to ijtihad and subject to khilaf, because it's a domain of difference in context, difference in understanding, and every human being, every scholar is influenced by a lot of things that are contextual. That is why you see some of the reasons why certain scholars on matters of gender and what have you, because of the contextual nature of their environment, having, sometimes you cannot even make sense of how they interpret, because they are a product of their own context. So on
As
very,
we are products
of
our
course, yes, we are
context.
product of our context, and we have our biases, we have our filters and our sentiments that to a large extent goes into the way we interpret text and the way we engage with text. And I think much as it has its own positive relevance in the way we deal with text and the way it helps us in understanding and relating with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, sometimes some of the negative biases that are tied to our own context also have some level of manifestation in the way we interpret the text. So we have to be very sensitive of that and be able to humbly appreciate the fact that it's open for difference of opinion, because it's domain of ijtihad, and therefore khilaf, diversity of opinion or difference of opinion, is valid in this particular domain of zanni related text. And the last mechanism is being able to classify divine text, the ma'alum min ad-dini bid-darura, that is divine, the Sharia related text, the qat'iyyu thubut, qat'iyyu dilala, from that which is dhanni in thubut and in dilala, the human fiqhi ijtihad domain. I think these are some of the important mechanisms that will really help in engaging the text and in trying to come up with fatwa or ijtihad.
I think you've mentioned some loaded terms which we will come to more carefully, inshallah. Qat'i thubut, qat'i dilala, in other words, what is definitive regarding the authenticity, what is definitive, categorical regarding the meaning and implication. And those things are straightforward. Those are the most straightforward teachings of Islam. Those ma'alum min ad-din bid-darura, those things that make us Muslims. Those things that are, the Prophet ﷺ said when somebody asked, if I only do the following things, I pray, I this, I that, is it enough for me to go to paradise? Yes. And even as the man was walking away, the Prophet ﷺ pointed to him as an example. If he keeps to what he said, that's an example of a person of paradise going there. Unfortunately, the areas where ijtihad comes in, human reasoning comes in, diversity of opinion comes in, becomes the area where sometimes we arrogate certainty. And probably, as you've said, one of the worst things to do is to have certainty on an area where scholars have diversity. To start treating something that is dhanni and speculative and an approximation of the truth as if it is an area beyond shadow of doubt, beyond all reasonable doubt. Brother Ibrahim, what would you add to this discussion?
Yeah, part of it is trying to identify that scholars need specialization. That the thing with Quran is just beyond, I know Arabic, I understand the Quran. Sometimes a verse will be clear cut, it's from God, like if it is the Quran. But you start having shades of meaning to the interpretation. So this idea of know what is dhanni and what is qat'i, that is what there is possibility of having more than one interpretation. You're not dealing with a straightforward equation now. If you're dealing with what you call simultaneous equation, you can't just assume just one answer for the variable. So people should also understand that when you say the meaning is speculative, you are not saying you are not sure of the meaning, but what you are saying is it accommodates more than one interpretation. So careful about believing only your own is right, all other people are wrong, and even believe they are going against God, and because of that they are disbelieving Quran. You know the way people drag equation and finally send you out of Islam. Very, very simple. We should be very careful. So differentiate between dhanni and qat'i and identify that scholars need to specialize and be very humble. That idea of don't believe what you have known is the last thing on everything is one important thing that we have to keep in mind.
And I think, along the same lines, and I would like you to elaborate more on this question of specializations, but what you find, for example, on not every, but on many verses of the Quran that deal with everyday life, if you are to look at the commentaries of scholars, those who go into the exegeses, the commentaries, the tafsir of the Quran from first generation to date, you will always find every generation coming out or feeling there's the need for them to produce another commentary of the Quran that deals with their current realities, that applies verses of the Quran where they see certain implications that an earlier generation didn't see. And so while we've got some great tafasir of the past, still useful for various reasons, but you'll always find, like today, discussions by scholars on verses of science that nowhere appeared in some of the earlier discussions on natural phenomena, discussions on psychology, in their interpretations of the Quran that earlier scholars didn't touch on, just because they were limited by their context, which was an advantage in some ways, disadvantage in others, as we are limited by our context, an advantage in one, disadvantage in others. Could you put us in the picture of some of the major fields of specializations within the Islamic sciences that are important and related to this subject of usul al-fiqh?
Yeah, like you said, Quran is one of it. But then even in the Quran, you discover that you have more specialties. There are people who specialize in learning the recitation. It's enough as a study to whatever level in your life. Qira'at, riwayat.
I actually know somebody with a PhD in 10 recitations, and his main specialization is on 3 of them. So yeah, just reciting.
So that's one, just to tell you one of the wonders of Quran. That's just on recitation. Then you come to people who specialize in the interpretation. They interpret, but they are not too good at relating it to context or reality. In fact, you have some who is only the balaga and the nahu of Quran that he did his whole PhD on. When you take the
language and the grammar.
Exactly. Yeah. That is what he focuses on. There are those who specialize in interpretation. Why was it revealed? This and that. But that's all.
Sabab al-nuzul.
Exactly. They can't relate it to, okay, what is the implication to me? They leave that to you. Then you have hadith. Most of the time, scholars of hadith are concerned, or we are concerned about compiling who is who, and history. Just to finally tell you that the hadith is authentic or not. But that's all. What is the fiqh of a hadith? What's the meaning? What exactly is the implication? And how is that related to that verse? And how is that related to me? They have little or not, they know little or nothing about it. In fact, there are people whose one is just to memorize hadith. Memorize 2,000 hadiths, he has memorized the whole of Quran. I have seen people who have memorized most of the Quran, but they can't translate 3 chapters. So then you have faqih. Fiqh, there are those now who try to, jurisprudence. These verses of Quran and hadith, how are they related to our day-to-day life? How practicable are they? And what does this mean relating to this, relating to your ablution? These are another specialists. They like extract now from various areas because their own angle of looking at things differ from that of Mufassir. A muhaddith just want to tell you that this is okay, it's authentic. Only few of them work on diraya, it's always riwayah. Then you have the usuli, who, of all these rulings of fiqh, this is wajib, this is haram, this is this, you cannot do this. Why do these scholars say what they say? And trying to tell you what happened, like what was the miracle or wonder, what's the working mechanism that led to these products you're seeing?
The equations.
These are the usuli. Then you have a number of other specialties that they are very useful and you need to be broad in them. And when a scholar speaks, you should actually know his relevance and his competence. If a scholar of hadith is speaking on some issues, you respect him, but you say, thank you, sir. Let me listen to another one. Listen today, like today, the world is tending towards specialization. Even major specializations are further broken to specialty. Before, all you have is electrical engineering. Now you have electrical engineering, computer engineering, telecommunication engineering, communication engineering, cyber security, and more is coming. Mechanical engineering, now you now have mechatronics, material engineering, this and that. Same thing in medicine. Before, when you say somebody is a surgeon, it means he's a consultant in surgery. But today you have pediatric surgeon, urologist, orthopedic, ENT. You can mention 10 cardiothoracic surgeons and a number of them. And everybody, the wonder is, when you come to a conference of doctors from various specialties discussing, if a doctor from one area speaks, all other people are laymen. So how much more of Sharia, the religion, with this kind of knowledge? So we should be very careful and really know who we are speaking to, who is speaking, what is qualification. In the past, you've got few scholars that are masters of many, but in our own time, it's not too common. You may only have people that have some broad general overview and knowledge of some of these things. So you start getting to an area where you see no. So what is important for people in Dawah and scholars is for people to sincerely know their level and their weakness. That's between you and God, so that you don't mislead people. And you should be humble enough to say, please, can you ask another person? I don't know this thing. As simple as that.
Thank you very much. Brother Nasir, what would you add to this issue of specializations?
Well, for quite a long time in the discourse around the subject of Usulul Fiqh, Maqasidu Sharia, we've been using different metaphors. Of all the specializations he mentioned, we haven't had Mufti, we haven't had Mujtahid. And if you look at the equation or the process, what Mujtahid does is taken from the output of this Mufassirun or Muhaddithun, and then looking at the context and crafting fatwa. So he's the one who engaged in the process of that ijtihad. And if he's done with his work, he passes it to the level of faqih, for example, or the mufti. Sometimes you would find the mujtahid becoming the mufti. Sometimes the mufti is a different person from the mujtahid. So your mufti will be the one that will now issue the fatwa. But then you have a body of, fatwas that constitute what is fiqh. So a body of fatwas over time on different subjects that constitute what is fiqh. So now the person that is responsible for allocating when somebody has a problem, for looking, okay, what is the available fatwas that we have? Which one is most fitting to your reality is the faqih. Somebody who deals with the rulings, somebody whose mastery is within the domain of available rulings or available, solutions that are already produced. So the only way he can help you is just be lucky that what you are looking for, the solution is within available, solution. Otherwise, then you'll have to wait for the mujtahid to come up, or the mufti to come up with a new solution. Now, having looked at all these specializations, scholars use different metaphors to describe the processes of ijtihad, the sources of Sharia. A very interesting and important metaphor we have been using is that of a tree. And now if you look at a tree, you have the root, you have the shoot, you have the branches, and you have the fruits. How do we locate each specialist in this diagram or in this metaphor of a tree? We said sources, the primary sources of Sharia are the ingredients, and therefore they constitute the foundation, they constitute the root. So whoever has expertise along the level of the root, should there be, around Quran, around Sunnah, that is the scholars of Hadith, the scholars of Quran, are to be located at the level of the root. They are the ones who worked on the nutrient that the entire tree used to grow and develop and produce fruits and produce branches. Now, if you move above the soil, sometimes this very strong foundation and root, it is what constitutes the strength of the entire tree, but it is so invisible. It is so invisible. So it's like you barely even see it sometimes. Now, if you move above the soil, if you move to the level of the shoot and the branches, that is the domain of your usuliyun, your mujtahidun, because that is where the process of ijtihad begins. Now, if you go above, where around the branches and the fruit, that is where you have your muftis, and that is where exactly you have, because the fiqh we said is the fruit, and so that is where you get your faqih, where he will just pluck and give, he will just pluck and give. And again, we also use medical metaphor in the medical industry. In the medical industry, you have people that their expertise is around the ingredients that are used in producing medicine, and they are your botanist, your agriculturalist, and many other experts in the foundational sciences, or what we call the natural sciences. They are the ones who worked at the level of the root. They are the ones who produce the raw materials that are needed for the industry to produce medicine. And now, if they are able to produce the raw materials at their own level, then they pass it to the industry. If you go to the industry, the person you meet is the industrial pharmacist. So the people, the expert in the natural sciences, your botanists, your agriculturalists, are representing the position of mufassirun, your muhaddithun, because they deal with the raw materials, they deal with the basic sciences. Now you are beginning to get into the domain of applied sciences, where you get the industrial pharmacist, who represent the position of the mujtahid or the usuliyun, who studies the problem, who studies the the physiology of the raw materials of the plant, and the raw materials that are provided, and is able to come up with a variety of solutions to the problem. So having done that, it moves above again to the next level, where it gets to the doctor. The doctor is the one who will engage with the patients, make the diagnosis, make the prescription. So he is like your mufti. He is the mufti that will make the prescription. When prescriptions are made, the next thing is you go to the pharmacy or medicine store or a chemist to go and acquire the prescription. There, if you go, the person you are going to meet is your clinical pharmacist. If it is a fiqh pharmacy, if it is a fiqh store, who you are going to get your pharmacist there is your faqih. It is your faqih that is going to give you available prescription. And that is where, when sometimes you go, sometimes you see the faqih going out of his way. Some people cut corners sometimes. Instead of seeing the mufti, they will go to the faqih. And the faqih will only tell you, okay, of malaria, we have this, we have this, we have that. And he will even ask you about your physiology and how you respond to. So everybody has his own level. And if you look at it carefully, you will see that they are interdependent. Although everybody make his contribution at a different stage of analysis, but they are somehow interdependent. And now coming to the issue of limitations in lawmaking. One interesting thing is acknowledging that interdependence and the difference in their, the difference in terms of their role and contribution at different stages of analysis, and that everybody is important in the equation and in the process. Everybody's role is significant and important, and you will begin to have problem the moment somebody cross from his own responsibility to the responsibility of others. Again, another thing, and that is where it's important to know part of the limitation. These experts in botany or agriculture that actually deals with the raw materials, the moment they decided to say, okay, this thing we produce, if you merge it with this, it will produce solution for this, then you will begin to see error. You are going to see problem, because they are crossing the domain that is not theirs. And therefore, if you come to the field of ijtihad, usually muhaddithun and mufassirun, if they begin to talk about matters of fiqh, matters of ijtihad, matters of qawaid, matters of usul, then you will begin to have a problem, because this is not their area of expertise. They have limitation in those areas. They don't have the requisite knowledge and training to meddle and to engage at that particular level ordinarily. Again, their expertise is, of course, a botanist is more with plants. So this is his domain. And that is where his contribution will be most significant, trying to establish the right plant and the condition of the plant, the purity of the plant, so that he can pass it to the industrialist. Just like a hadith scholar, his expertise is establishing the authenticity of hadith, ensuring that it is fit for application, for analysis. That ends his own role. And the moment he stops there, until he understands that and stops within his own limit, then you will always be having problem. Ordinarily, this is what is obtainable. Even within the field of tafsir, you've got a variety of specializations. Some will specialize on the methodology of one particular scholar, maybe Ibn Kathir. Some will specialize on the methodology of Zamakhshari, where he talked about expertise in linguistic meanings. And some will specialize in the tafsir of Sayyid Qutb fi Zilal al-Quran, where they will tell you, if you want to appreciate the poetic nature of the Quran, the appreciation of the rhyming, wordings and language of the Quran, then go to Ibn Kathir, fi Zilal al-Quran of Sayyid Qutb, because of his expertise in language and literature and poetry. And that has manifested in the tafsir itself. If you want to appreciate history as it relates to the Quran, then go to Ibn Kathir. That is what they will tell you. They will tell you, if you want to see maqasidi approach in interpretation, go to Ibn Ashur. And different, specialization and expertise, even in just a particular field. So the understanding of limitations, that if you are talking about interpretation, context of the Quran, this is the domain of the Mufassirun. Another thing that is important is also understanding that if you go to the domain, meaning experts in usul and qawaid and maqasid are not experts in Quran, but the good advantage that usually the usuliyun have is that they must have some level of expertise in all these fields. But I think the essential thing is understanding these limitations, and everybody should remain on his lane. That will help in minimizing some of the problems when it comes to the issue of ijtihad. Allah knows best.
Jazakumullahu khairan. I think we have seen a lot of misconceptions, mistaken fatwas, inappropriate fatwas produced by people who are great scholars in their particular field, but have very weak grounding in the fatwa, in the study of fatwa crafting, in the subjects of usulul fiqh, qawaid al-fiqhiyah, and maqasid sharia. And as you've said, somebody who studies tafsir and somebody who studies hadith, they may be wonderful scholars, well respected in their areas, but they haven't studied Saddu Zariya. They have not studied Maslaha. They have not studied Urf. They have not studied the Qawaid. They have not studied the Maqasid. They have not studied Istishab or Qiyas or this or that. And unfortunately, they come with their great, wonderful reputations, move into an area that is outside their field of specialization and competence, make statements there, and the respect that they had is what gives them authority to speak in areas where they honestly don't know what they're talking about, and make big blunders, unfortunately. I think the metaphors you use have been really wonderful. Now, probably try to summarize by saying the whole field of law and lawmaking is what is called fiqh. And within that field of fiqh, you have those who know the legal theory and the principles of lawmaking. They may not be qualified to do so, but they are well grounded in those principles and equations that you call the usulis. And those who are, or the usuliyun, they are grounded in the principles of interpretation and lawmaking. Those who are competent enough, like the industrial pharmacist, to actually make the new medicine, to make the new laws, are the mujtahids. Ibn Rushd, I think, said in his discussions on this topic how many scholars are good at repairing old shoes, but not how to make a new shoe for a different size of foot. That requires a special type of cobbler. And the mujtahid is the one who can see a new situation and produce new laws that address and meet the objectives of Sharia there. The mufti, as you said, is like the medical doctor. He is also a faqih in that he is dealing with law, but his main specialization is he is a local. He is somebody who understands his contexts, understands the subject area, knows the differing opinions, understands the principles, but is prescribing what is the best medicine produced by the mujtahids of maybe various schools, but deciding what is the best after diagnosing this person's problems, or as you put it, the best malaria medicine. Many medicines for malaria, but some are for children, some are for people who are pregnant, some are for people who are elderly, some are for young, some are those who are not allergic to this. The mufti is the one who, through the tools of ijtihad, istihsan and others, will decide what is the most appropriate fatwa, which is why he's called a mufti. And the general knowledge person who I know the law, but I'm not qualified to make new laws. I may not even be qualified to prescribe, but I know what the law is, and maybe even of just my madhab or other madhabs, we call that person a faqih, somebody who is just knowledgeable of the law. I'd like to say thank you very much for this discussion, the specializations. Inshallah, when next we meet, we will be going through the level of certainty that the different proofs offer and how scholars classified evidence into what they were certain about and could say, this is Allah's position, this is definitely the Prophet's position as a representative of Allah, and this is a position where there's a level of presumption, where there's no definitive categorical certainty about, and we look at how the scholars classified evidence and the implications of each. I'd like to thank you both. Jazakumullahu khairan. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Until we meet next time. Assalamu alaikum.